Alright, so it's been a while on this channel. I still have some older things to upload about the van, but I figured I would do like a powertrain. I have to do it as a slideshow, which in some ways is more convenient because you can just flip through, for me anyway. So, basically just showing like the powertrain going in, meaning like the transmission and engine. The rear end was already done. And what I did to that, so it's an 8.8. Um, I can't think of the exact width, but it is the widest version of the 8.8 that comes in the Econolines. And luckily, I did find some chromoly axles from Nitro Axle, so they are a larger diameter. They're still 31 spline, um, and therefore I had to get larger outer bearings. And again, I can't even think of the diameter. It's been a couple years, but so I did that. I did a rear disc brake conversion that is typically um, done on Broncos, but it worked beautifully. It's very simple. It does use GM, like old late 70s. Uh, well, they typically will call them Eldorado calipers, but I think it's like different A bodies, and so it's pretty easy to find pads and parts for those. So it does now have rear disc brakes, and this particular van it does have rear ABS, so that way you don't have to install what is it called in it like an actuator. So if you didn't have ABS, you would have to get something that was equivalent to that. Um, to spread the braking force evenly or something. But what else? So it also has a Yukon Duragrip, so it's got limited slip, posi, whatever, and then it does have a 373 Ford racing gear. And on top of that, I also did welds. Well, it's a system where it welds to the steel tubes and then it bolts to part of the pumpkin where there used to be kind of this vibration damper. Um, because unless you have, nickel rod welding ability, you can't just, weld steel and iron together, so it's mechanically situated. Usually an over-the-top truss is for off-roading, for lateral load, like if you're going over a rock, and especially this 8.8 is the widest that Ford makes, so uh, it would especially be important if you were running this particular rear end. What else back there? So yeah, so normally for like if you're drag racing, you would have a truss that goes underneath, but this was just to keep the tubes attached to the pumpkin. Like I don't think it's gonna be making so much torque and torsional forces that it would spin the tubes, but it was just, why not? It was affordable enough. You have to weld it together yourself, and then it welds to the tubes, and then you have three bolts to the pumpkin. So, it's heavier dutier now, so I'm not really at all worried about the rear end of this build. Um, anyway, so that's all done. Thankfully, it was a lot of work. So this was way back when my floor jack still was like brand new in a very obviously like broken, unfinished driveway. So I had to put these planks down, and what I had was this TCI makes a transmission jack that goes, well, it's like a pan that goes under the oil pan, so you can easily like install or remove a transmission. Like that was so helpful. I didn't even jack the van up. I just loaded up the jack. Obviously, the drive shaft yoke just slides out of the splines. Obviously, you have to unbolt the mount there, but other than that, I just took my foot, moved it forward, got to this point where I was able to kind of muscle it forward. AODs are definitely not light, especially if they still got a handful of quarts of oil in them too. But But I was able to lift it out of there myself. So from there, it got carried, team carry. I couldn't carry this in that easily myself, but so you see like the planetary, um, different drive hubs. The thing with this though, luckily, is so the early style AODs have a an iron drum. Like all the drums are iron, so obviously that helps making it heavy, and it also, as far as rotational mass, that becomes heavier and puts more strain, and probably a loss of power to the wheels. But um, this one did have a stamped steel drum, so it had like the 90 plus or the 91 to 93 or 4 ish. Um, so that was one thing that whenever this was overhauled, they had done. I knew it was a reman because it had like a tag on it. And as far as I know, this van never left New Jersey or New York, and it had the tag was from Kentucky or somewhere. I wonder if I kept it. I should have kept it. You can see the little anti-clunk spring there, and I think that's the governor valve for your wide open throttle shift points. Why is this being like that? So then you can see getting a little more into it. It actually uses different clutches. So for 1, 2, 3 gears, it's using a Raybestos Red Stage 1s. They do make blue stage, which is technically higher, but the problem with street driving with those is they tend to glaze up, so they're really kind of race only. So it's one of those things where, street and race, like, a lot of people buy like, oh, it's race or race only. Usually things are specified that way for a good reason. And these will handle, I mean, pretty much probably like a maximum built AOD with however much power you're running. But again, if it is like race only, then you might want to go to blues, but because of how they'll glaze over. But then when I bought that, that was the early style teeth, which I can't really show a contrast, maybe in the next photo. But with the early style teeth, they're not, it's like they don't have as much of an engagement, so that's why they're a little inferior. Um, so what I ended up doing is I got so the first 3 gears are all Raybestos, but then because these had an early style direct drive drum or your overdrive, I had to get a different set. Like I couldn't find them, so I ended up going with Alto Red Eagles, which are also great, that came with choline steel clutches. Um, and that came with like 8 of them or something. So instead of, what is it, like 5 or 6 clutches, now there's like 8. So obviously they're just thinner because it fits under the same snap ring. So you can see those here. So that's my overdrive now, which is pretty intense. And then as far as my piston, and you can see these are the late model teeth. And it looks like what they had in there, these green, like these olive green looking ones, are still heavy duty. They're HEGs or high energy graphite. Like those are fine for towing and stuff like that. But not quite as high performance as like a Raybestos Stage 1 Reds or the Alto Red Eagles. My steels were mostly fine. There wasn't like really hot spotting or warping. I assume how this was driven too, like it wasn't a concern. If this had been abused in like a Mustang, then I'd probably scrutinize them a bit more. But this just so happened to have choline for it, so I just went with that kit. What else? So other than that, like, I mean, that's totally cool. But the overdrive piston or servo is a Sonax super hold, and you actually had to grind the tip of it yourself to get within like 400 thousandths or something. Uh, so I had to like take a grinder, but that one supposedly has the strongest spring, even compared to uh, the Superior brand one, the Super Servo, I think it is. So, and obviously both of those are great. But as far as my band, You can see in the background there was right here, I think that's a 2-inch band, and I forget, I don't remember why I stuck with the 1.5, but it's still Kevlar, and I'm not too worried about the holding of that. And even with that, with those clutches and the better piston, I'm probably still not going to go wide open throttle in overdrive. So it'll just be really strong for cruising and stuff. But I probably will stay in drive because I've blown out a couple of overdrives, which probably weren't as modified, honestly, in my Thunderbird. Other than that, the transmission also has, I don't remember if this was the one that came out or the new one, either way. This was the only thing I didn't do myself, was I found a transmission company that happened to be selling, pre-modified valve bodies. So that made me, I just went for it. It was one less thing I had to do. Like, I'm fully well capable of doing all the drilling and stuff needed for, and this has like the Transgo shift kit, the upgraded spring, what else? And they also sent with it, you can see right here, so this is your speed governor valve that goes on the tail shaft, and that has a valve in it. So from the factory, the size of the opening dictates that, if you go wide open throttle in a stock AOD, usually, I don't know if the Mustangs were different, but they're probably not. But it's about 4,600 RPM that they'll shift. So you can upgrade that to be like 5,000, 5,500, 6,000 plus. So I just put in a 5,500 because of what the engine's power band was. So there that is in. But it looked like the valve body that came out did actually have a shift kit, and that wouldn't surprise me because they are better for the life of your clutches too, just to have that harsher shift. Other modifications to the AOD, well, it does have one thing I didn't mention too. It has a hardened input shaft from TCI, so I think it's a Vasco material. It has, on the drive hub or the front, it has instead of a typical snap ring that commonly would break even in a regular stock 5.0 HO, it has like this spiral ring lock, and they're kind of one-offs. So when you disassemble, you have to clip them off with cutters, but the kit came with like 4 of them, so but they're a lot stronger than snap rings. So little things like that, and then like most of the Torrington bearings and such were replaced. Other mods, you can see right here, this is 2-quart larger oil pan, so obviously it'll take longer for the oil to get really hot. The only thing to keep in mind with that is if you do get it to certain temperatures, it'll take longer to cool down. However, I do have one of the larger size stacked plate B&M supercoolers, so I don't think that's going to be a problem. But one thing to consider is your torque converter. So I would always go with a larger one, and especially an aftermarket cooler, but here's the thing, anything before 40, it's not going to really be locked up. So this is a lockup, but before 40, like once you hit 40, it's direct drive, but it tends to get hotter before 40. And also, this is, instead of a 12-inch, this is just a 10-inch converter. So this is a TCI Street Fighter with an anti-ballooning plate, so it's like a 3,000 plus. Originally, I did get this for when I had the build with a supercharger, but just budget-wise, and then I was pretty sure that the blower wasn't going to clear the master cylinder. At the same time, the power band of the engine, that shouldn't be too much converter. It should actually fall right on the torque peak, so off the line, the truck should be really moving. Now, if it was like a 4,000, like that would be too much, but I think that it's right about the limit for the NA build. And And again, with the 373 gears, hopefully getting some, fatter tires. Like I'm looking at 295 50s. Um, like no drag radials or anything crazy. I do also have ladder bar or traction bars, not ladder bars, for the rear to keep those leaf springs okay. But um, underneath that, so the flex plate, I went from a 50 ounce. The engine and everything was balanced to a 28 ounce. So it's the old 302 balance. The reason they went to 50 is once they started putting the 302 um, in like Lincolns and stuff like that, it runs a little bit smoother with having a higher weight balance. So that was kind of a luxury decision. And I'm pretty sure the 351s were kind of always 28 ounce. And then the firing order too. That's why it was tricky to find this. And actually, it is an SFI rated plate. It's a little bit thicker than a standard plate, and I was worried once I finally got everything in. I mean, I'll talk about that more when I show the doghouse, but I was worried that I wasn't going to have enough play. So yeah, so that's the AOD. These are fittings for the cooler line. Oh, and then if you do get like a pan like this one is an LPW. There are other manufacturers, and I've seen like the same casting under different. One thing I modified is I did thread and tap it, or tap and thread it for a temperature pung, and that's a glow shift bulkhead. They sell these awesome little kits with a plastic washer, and then I just used ARP thread sealer on the thread to make sure it's nice and secure, and then that takes like an 1/8 inch NPT. So that is the AOD. This is how I got it back in, and it's funny because at first I didn't think of it. I got the tranny out of the house on a dolly, actually. I did this all myself somehow. I had someone kind of spotting me, but it was like, I did it myself. But and then I was like, oh, I can see how far the floor jack, you can see the difference, how the years have worn on it. I didn't treat it too kindly. It got left out a lot. This is what happens when you're doing an open air build. There's a lot of rattiness. But what I did was I just thought, okay, this might jack up far enough, and I was right. Obviously not quite all the way, but I just put one of these blocks of wood in there, and it was more than plenty. Obviously I started with the stock oil pan, like I didn't want to damage, crack, or mess with the aluminum one. Plus the height of it would be different, so I felt installing it would be trickier. It'd have to be lifted higher and so on. But that actually worked out quite nice. You can see I'm using like a Moroso like steel cord gasket as well, reusable. You can notice too with the new Moog springs, this is something I'm still a little worried about. You can see my shoddy bodywork here, but it's better than a hole, I guess. It's holding that together. But the positive camber, you can notice unladen, is pretty intense. It did get a lot better with like the full powertrain, and obviously there's still things that need to go in there. I'm hoping it'll go down further once like there's more stuff, or even once I'm in it, etc. Because that's the only thing with these earlier I-beams. It doesn't have the adjustable camber like an F-150, so it's really annoying with getting the right spring height, and then obviously even the height doesn't dictate their weight, and maybe you could cut them if you had to. Like they do make drop spindles and stuff for these, which is pretty cool. But yeah, that's the only thing I'm a little worried about. And the problem with these springs is they're progressive rate, so they're not a regular open coil, so they're kind of bunched up at the top. But yeah, this was all done in like Pour 15, but again, an outdoor project, you just have to get used to patina and rust and like get to it when you can get to it. But yeah, this TCI thing, well worth it, way well worth the investment. That made this job so simple. I did cut it though, so the shaft that goes into where the original, I don't even know what you call that, but I did like cut half of that off because it was hitting a crossbar and stuff, so it actually sits flush. It's slightly wobbly, but it's nothing you can't simply control with your hand. So then obviously I had this wood here, it just slid in nice and easy. There's a different shot of it. The only weird part is this part of the cross member is like comes out further, so it's gotta be at an angle, and the pan like just fits through that, so not a whole lot of friction to deal with. You can see it coming through there, like it's a little sideways, but no big deal. You can see here I have those are new Rancho 5000s. You can see I don't know how bad all the 4 rotors are, but chances are by the time this is driving I may need to replace them if they're pitted. For the overall investment, I guess not a huge deal, but I didn't need to, but I did get brand new radius arms, and obviously like all new rubber, plastic cups and whatnot, and the brackets as well. I still have the old ones, so obviously I'm not just gonna toss out good metal, so I don't know what I'll do with them. There it is, sans torque converter, obviously, and then it's a good idea to have a floor jack, because obviously like half of the weight is supported by the block, and you wouldn't want to put all the pressure on there or it would just nosedive, so it's definitely tricky by yourself though. And the other thing to keep in mind is you have different mounting locations. Obviously this van came with like 4 different engine options, maybe 5, 50, 58, so 302, 351, 300 inline 6, 460 big block, and then if it had the 7.3 diesel, so that I think that's part of why it is. But something to remember, this is offset, so I think right here it might have been in the wrong spot at first and I had to move it over, but yeah, they're offset toward the passenger seat, where the transmission, so you'll see 3 holes, they go to the passenger side, so that there should be a 3rd slot toward the driver's seat. So you can see right here, this is bumped over. Luckily I found that fairly quick online, but at first I was trying to like remember, but if you really look, you can tell like the tunnel is kind of offset. So, but it's very subtle. So now I have to go, I forgot these are in the, I have to go all the way past it. I just wanted to start with the transmission, so. Alright, so here's just a cool shot. Obviously I still need to do some body work in here. This was a neat shot. Also with the ridiculous plenum that the trucks have, again, longer runners equal velocity equals torque. So this is why all of your Ford trucks had this on the 50 and 58s. So, because it made, and because of that, I want to say their peak torque was, I'd have to look it up, but I want to say like, 3,000-ish, something like that. But then their power is only peaking at like 4,000 something, if that, like pretty low because of the long runners, but smaller V8 in a big truck, so that was why they have these things. So here's just another shot in the garage. I think this was just a glamour shot, I guess. I have my 1.6 Scorpion roller rockers. These are 24 pound-hour injectors, or 250 cc for metric people. What else? I don't know. Okay, this is a better shot in the daylight. Those are Lunati Voodoo springs, retainers, keepers. They're not a dual spring. That's actually, it's just like a damper that they come with, so you can break in a cam with those and be fine. Like I talked to a Lunati tech about that just to make sure. So here's something interesting with Chinese shorty headers. These are 1/5/8 with a, well, I think they're technically a 3-inch primary, but with the ball joint, or ball cup and ball, whatever you call this, I want to say this narrows to a 2.5 or something. But if these were regular headers without that, like I think they're technically a 3-inch primary. Either way, pretty standard aftermarket header. The problem with them being Chinese, so what I did with them is, number one, they're stainless steel, like that's great, but uh, the other thing I did was I took Eastwood internal ceramic coating, and luckily the casting of these was rough enough to where the coating stuck, so they are technically ceramic now. The problem with this shot is I had these with like 2 bolts, right? What I hadn't realized until the engine was in the van was that they were not perfectly aligned. So now I've had to do some grinding work, and the gaskets were even worse. Luckily, I got like aftermarket. What are they? I don't even want to say the name, but because if I screw it up. Um, so luckily I do have way better gaskets now. So it's just a matter of grinding those holes out a little bit. But I wasn't about to be like, oh, now I need $400 BBK headers just so I know they're aligned and whatnot. Like, not worth it. You can see another bulkhead installation on the pan, so that's an oil temp sensor as well. Same one that I put on the transmission. Um, what else about this? Obviously the stock valve covers because they're tall. I had lower ones, but they wouldn't clear these. Some other shot. This is a good shot to talk about what the engine is, I guess. If I haven't, I thought I made a video about that. So it is a 306 block that's slightly thicker casting than what came out of the van. So it's a triple X, but I don't think that dictates that. A lot of people seem to not really know, and I think that is like a location marker, even though that's a Windsor, so it's built in Windsor, Ontario. But yeah, that's still kind of a mystery. The difference, though, is the casting in the van had a knock sensor, and I don't remember if that was an F0 for 90 or an E9 for like 89. But this block I got from a company in Texas. It was machined. It's bored 30 over, so now it's 306 technically. So the only real difference is no knock sensor. And I was kind of bummed when I finally realized that, because I avoided running a gear drive. But that probably, there's some cons with that, but the noise, I guess, can be fun. But I did get like a really nice Cloys. It's got a true double roller, and that uses like a really nice Iwis chain, which is German. They use those in like Volkswagens, I guess, for years, like in the Beetles and everything. So it's a nice chain. It's Iwis or Jwis, but so it does just have a regular timing chain. What else? Going from the bottom up, it's an aftermarket pan, but factory casting. The old one was a little rough. It could probably be treated and repainted. It was gonna have a girdle with a windage tray, but I just went with ARP bolts, so it's just the regular 2-bolt main, but it does have a crank scraper. It has a forged crank. It has forged I-beam rods out of an Explorer, and then it has coated Speed Pro pistons. They are hyper pistons. So they're just cast pistons, but it's now an NA build, and it's only like 9-to-1 compression. It's got all Cleveite 77 bearings, so like the conrods, the mains, even the camshaft tunnel has Cleveite 77s, which is interesting because they're actually molecular, like king bearings. But the big difference between king bearing and Cleveite or Mala is their trimetal versus bimetal, like molecular. The thing is, if you're running forged cranks, though, is you really want trimetal and that layer of Babbitt, because if for whatever reason, RPM, horsepower, whatever, if you break that oil film and you go metal to metal, you want that layer of Babbitt so it doesn't scratch your crank or anything. And then you could lose oil pressure, etc. Um, what else? Then from there, oh, it's got a Lunati bare bones cam. It's like fairly modest. I guess you could call it like a 3/4 cam. I stuck with flat tappet, but the Lunati cam, it's like a, what is it like? It's like a 476 thousandths, 492, 215, 224 at 50 duration. Advertised durations like 281, 293 on the card. Um, it's like a 112-degree lobe separation angle, and I want to say that there is advance built in by maybe 4 degrees. So that's the cam. Other than that, everything is like super ported except the heads are factory valve size, but they are stainless steel valves that are back faced with undercut stems. You'd have to go through all my E7 videos. You can get a better idea of all the porting work that went into this, but the lower intake is ported to the point where we call it epoxy porting, where we're straightening these, not we, just me, but I'm straightening these tunnels. We as the community, but where I straighten these tunnels enough to where you blow a hole in it deliberately, and then you're just using a reinforced epoxy, in this case JB Weld mixed with aluminum filings. This in between is just a 3/8 phenolic spacer, creates a potential heat barrier. Obviously, it's lengthening the runners, but which I didn't want necessarily, because my objective, because of the torque converter and the cam, was to raise the peak power up a little bit. So this was opened up, and the cross-sectional area and all the openings coming from the plenum chamber into the tunnels were open to try and bring that RPM up a few hundred points. This is a BBK. Obviously the factory, it is a large throttle body. It's like, what is the factory one's like 51, it's like 100 something, 102 millimeter. This one is a dual 61, so now it's 122 millimeter throttle body. It does have BBK underdrives. Obviously the alternator pulley not pictured. Obviously I showed the 24 pound-hour injectors. So it's basically a super stock or pro stock, obviously an MSD Pro billet distributor. So the heads, I'm expecting, like, if you want numbers, I'm hoping they flow, like, within the cam lift, I'm hoping they flow like 210. Nothing insane, but maybe like over a GT40. And the big win is really on the intake and the plenum, is I'm expecting that the plenum now, on its better runners, will flow in the upper 200 CFM range. And say, for example, like the 1 and the 5 runner will, I think those factory were like 140. Now they should be well over 200. So it makes a huge difference. So the plenum and intake, like, this is great. Like, with better heads, it would make even more power, obviously. So this is like a makeshift air intake where I don't know what the final thing will be, but this was just an idea. As long as I can, I'm wondering if it'll clear the accessories, but you can turn these up to, you know, within the hood being open. But really just for like break-in and stuff, I just had to get some way together. Here's a way better shot of the throttle body. Can't really see the epoxy, maybe in another shot. That is like there's the balancer is, I forget the spec on it, but it is like a performance 28-ounce balancer, so it's not just a stalker. Here's another important thing. So if you're like me, and yeah, in hindsight, I could have made this a roller for more money, made more power, but I don't know, I guess my excuse is, oh, I want it to be a true super stock or pro stock build. So it is still running flat tap. It's like the factory, but they are upgraded to Lunati micro-trol, so the oil control is a lot better. And the snap ring, instead of like those snap rods, they use like actual like tabs that are a lot stronger. And I assume better plungers and springs and stuff. But anyway, so here's an important thing though that you want to make sure, to have a successful break-in. The thing that people don't realize in a flat tappet is it's not just a film of oil that's getting pushed up and down from the camshaft lobe. What's happening is the lifter is actually spinning a bit. If you think of like a vertical and horizontal gear set, or basically your rear end, which is what obloid, I forget what you call like a ring and gear. But if you can picture that in your head, a horizontal to vertical, that's basically what a lobe and a flat tappet are doing together. And the surface of the butt of a tappet is not flat. So one thing that will kind of tell you if you're going to have a successful break-in, and again, that's very stressful to think about, and it makes me realize like, oh, I should have went roller, but I'm up for the challenge, and I think that it'll go fine, and I've taken all the precautions. And the one you can do is make sure that your push rods are actually spinning. So what I did is I just took Sharpie, obviously I had to clean these with a little alcohol, and took some Sharpie, marked it, tried to be as consistent as possible, getting it at 6 o'clock, technically, or 12 o'clock, depending on where you're standing. And then I gave the engine about 10 to 15 rotations, and they all did about a quarter turn. You can see a little flash rust there is in the way, I think, but that Sharpie is basically in there. So they're not all going to be perfectly synced up with each other, and that could be torque differences. It could be the bore itself. Like, I did clean the bores and make sure when I installed my flat tappets, like, they were going in and out snug, but enough to where there wasn't real friction, and especially friction under the power of the engine. So if you can get these, if they're spinning mostly evenly when you hand turn it, then you should be okay, or I should be okay. So that was good to see. The only thing I would say with that is when you are turning over the engine, that you're potentially wiping off some assembly lube, but as long as it was slathered good, like, I think you can afford a bit of rotation, and as long as you're like gonna prime the engine, which you should be doing anyway before a first start, and get oil up in everywhere, I think it should be okay. But I have, I don't like turn it over all the time for the sake of turning it. So that was just, I would rather risk knowing that my tappets are turning than not doing that test at all, because you're not going to do that test when you first fire it. So that's the only way to do it. What's this photo? Oh, here's something fun. So getting this in was pain, because these original or aftermarket motor mounts were, I don't know, they had like taller rubber in them than the original ones, and I was worried that because this isn't an angle, if these get taller, that means that setting these holes up is wider, and maybe they would have went in, but just for one person trying to rock this thing, they wouldn't. So I looked for shorter ones, finally got the right manufacturer, but when I installed those ones, what I didn't realize was, just because they're casting, I mean, you're only going to find these from, like India or places, and I'm really thankful they still make them. I don't know how long the rubber or whatnot will last, but what I noticed was this came out too far. So when it was in the truck, I tried to put the oil filter on, and this section was in the way, this wing. So I've been slowly grinding this away with like an 1/8 inch Dremel, and I did nick a little off of this to get to it, but pretty sure the oil landing and the oil gasket is narrow enough, and like this provides ample room for that. So what else with Vans? So Vans, it's number one, this cherry picker boom has to be all the way out. Number two, you can really only do it on the front hole of one of these intake style ones. And it's still, you really still have to end up pushing this thing. And the other thing is this body cross section here kind of gets in the way, so you gotta like jack the truck up so that, like, if I could have, well, not really. I was gonna say you could maybe grind some material off the lift, but that's right where the plunger is for the hydraulics. So you have to kind of like get it right under this lip. It's really, this looks amazing. Like, oh, you have a fully open area. It'd be more amazing if you just like, I don't know. I'd almost cut this off in the future and just re-weld it or bolt it back together. 'Cause it's really just holding the body together. It's not like, I don't think that would really compromise much if you were to do that. But honestly, if I did it that way, this would be amazing. Like, it'd be so easy to put engines in and out of it. Here's just another like retro graded shot. Like, I know it was fully dressed, now it's not, because obviously this is how it went in. But so flexplate, luckily that went without a hitch. Used, ARP nuts on that. I didn't bother derusting the this plate. I forget what you call this, but it just like keeps crud out of the bell housing and stuff. But it's gonna get covered with oil and stuff, so I wasn't too worried about that. Here's just another cool shot. Color wise, because obviously it has some red in there, but I thought just the purple, blue, and silver looked nice. You can see I really went all out and made a very bright timing marker. I thought that was important because it's hard to see. I still don't know how it's really going to get timed. With everything on there, I don't know how you really even see that, to be honest. Alright, so there it is in the truck, and this was doing a height test with a spacer if I was going to run a phenolic spacer. The TV cable bracket, you can remove more material off of this. Like, you can move almost a whole inch off of that. So this fireproofing is just kind of deceptive in that shot. But I was just seeing, I have a 1-inch spacer as well, but at that point it's like now I'm re-lengthening the runners. So I'm not, a 3/8 inch is not really enough to truly make it a huge difference, but it was more the heat barrier, because doghouses can be pretty hot. Here's a better shot, so you can see that there's definite clearance there, but I'm probably going to shave off like a 1/2 inch from that or something, just so that's that. So that was finally in. Then I came back and I started adjusting it again because I didn't like how the mounts were lined up. So finally getting it all aligned to the transmission. But yeah, again, I came back and I unbolted the transmission, put the hoist back on, and was really trying to get these holes, like, I guess what I'm trying to say is making sure that how far out this comes is even to this bank, if that makes sense. And you could only tell by how high it is up in the slit. And obviously these holes are not direct. They give room for play and adjustment. And obviously that's why you have a yoke, like a U-joint, stuff like that. And the engine was still level. Like, obviously that's also important. But I was just really trying to perfect it. This is just checking those headers, seeing if it's going to clear the starter motor, which it's tight, but it should still be fine. And I do have the collector tubes that go on that. Just another shot. So these baffles and these valve covers were punched in, so I do have to, I think I have to tap them back down a bit for this PCV valve to be able to go back in that. And that was why I was glad. I'm hoping they work, because it was nice, actually. Like, yeah, you want to dress your shit up, but it was nice to just have the factory valve covers and not worry about, like, oh, I have to get a filter because this won't hook to this, and blah, blah, blah. This is just a shot of louvers. I did install on the hood just classic 20s, 30s hot rod style punched louvers. I originally did this because of the supercharger, but you know, it can't hurt to let some heat out of there. I still gotta put the bug screens underneath them, but it does make a cool look, and they really match the rain catch here too, I thought, so it looks pretty neat when you're sitting in there. You can barely see it. Um, I thought about putting a lift plate under the seat. Like, I would like to get like an inch higher, but it's got worn out foam. So I thought about taking one of the back captain's chairs and swapping it so it's like a fresh seat. There's my crazy gauge pod setup, 6 gauges. Oh, that's everything, I guess. So yeah, so it was a process to do all myself. I've still got to like do a few things. I've mocked up a little bit of the exhaust. I am running like EGR. The only thing I'll say that's tricky when you're using spacers is if you have your EGR pipe coming off the intake to like, it goes about here, is it might have to be bent. And the one that came off of it, it was ribbed. So it was like they built it so you could flex it. And the new aftermarket one is regular steel. So I might have to use the torch and cut the fiberglass off of it to get to it. But yeah, I'm pretty happy. So now, you know, the engine's in it, the transmission, the rear end. So as far as powertrain, like there's still other shit I have to do. Like the rest of the body mounts on this side have to be bolted up. I think they're all in, but I still have to bolt them in, which is a process with one person to not have someone underneath like holding the nut down, I guess. But I've gotten by with it. You know, fuel rail hasn't moved. I have a curb in adjustable fuel pressure regulator, so as far as starting to hook stuff back up, like that's, you start with that, like your injectors go in, the fuel rail goes on top, bolts in. From there, there's obviously all your vacuum lines, and then from there, your water lines and stuff like that. But I have my, you know, I've got my new fuel tanks, new sending units. I already hooked up the new external. So here's the thing with these vans or F-150s, they use 2 in-tank low pressure pumps, which are only like, what is it, 12 psi or something. Then this has a tank selector valve. From there, you have an external, and I want to say I didn't put in a 255. I think it's like a 190, which should support the power it has between the 190 and the 24 injectors. But yeah, it does use 3 fuel pumps, so it's pretty wild. And then if you look at other things, I did already make all new nylon lines. The only other thing is the charcoal canister and the vent tubes. I made one nylon to the vent tube of one of the tanks, and now I have to run the other, and then I have to look at the sizing of the charcoal can. I'd like a whole new charcoal can, but I had a kind of a mishap where the jack, like, I don't know how I ended up doing this, but I think I accidentally jacked up. I was jacking up the frame or something, and it actually hit the bracket that holds the canister. And I mean, that steel is tough. Like, I cannot bend it with my hand. So the canister is kind of stuck at the moment. I could like always move that, but so I'm trying to be, you know, environmental, like be, you know, there's no reason to not run EGR or run the cats. Like, you can have everything that they wanted, but it's double the power from the factory. And the only things that have really changed on this are technically the cam and valve train. And yes, the casting sizes and whatnot, like it's ported, but I'm saying it's still all the factory casting. So it's kind of a cool feeling, honestly. Like, I know it's not going to be like the fastest thing on the planet, but at the same time, the power that it is going to be making, plus having that 3000 stall converter, plus the rear end setup, and then if I actually get meaty enough tires, I think it's definitely going to be a blast. on the street for a big van. And then, you know, what it doesn't have in that, we have the crazy interior of a boogie van and a conversion van. So, anyway, so, you know, winter's here now. So I've done minimal stuff. I've been cleaning the garage, and you know, I have my budget going up this month, so I'm gonna be able to buy some little nickel and dime things, you know, whatever. I should be good to go as far as everything I need to actually start this thing, but you know, you take baby steps. I do one thing I definitely want is, so all these new brake lines I did are, it's NICOP, so it's nice and easy to bend. Like, you can bend it with your hands and not really worry about kinking it. Like, I still try to use the tool and be careful with the bending, but um, I was using a cheap flare kit, and I didn't. The thing with the NICOP is when you go to tighten this, it might help, you know, conform to what you're doing, but I did want to invest in one of those like $60 flare tools that will maybe make a nicer flare, because I don't want to play around with the brakes. The other thing is it does have new parking brake cables and stuff as well, and I have a couple I have to install that go to the new rear discs. So that is it, and that is all. I know it's a long video, but it's a long process, and there's a lot to talk about with doing something like this. So